on this Sunday night.
Bringing in the seatbelts is a good first step.
Why Transport Canada is only now admitting seatbelts on school buses could save lives. The Fifth Estate uncovers the government has had the research for years, why it's never been made public until now.
It does drastically affect your actual income when people make a cancellation. That was brutal.
Ever been transferred or endlessly put on hold when you try to cancel your phone or cable? Workers for Canada's biggest telecoms are going public about the tactics they use to keep you on the hook.
And tackling your cannabis questions.
What is considered impairment at work, and who decides that?
Very difficult to tell if somebody's, quote unquote, impaired by cannabis.
A national conversation to get answers about what pot legalization means for you. 72 hours and counting. This is The National. Every day in Canada, about 2 million kids take a school bus, most with no seatbelts. And for decades, Transport Canada has been saying it's for the best, that seatbelts can do more harm than good. But now the Fifth Estate uncovered a study that shows seatbelts on school buses could prevent injuries and deaths, and that Transport Canada has had that study for 8 years and done nothing. Here's Bob McEwen with that investigation.
For 40 years, Transport Canada has told Canadians school bus seatbelts simply aren't necessary, which seems to defy common sense, even to the kids.
If you get into an accident, you would stay in your spot because a seatbelt makes you safe.
Actually, a minute ago, I almost fell off the seat. That just influenced my decision even more.
So how is it that to this day, children in school buses in Canada are still unprotected by seatbelts?
Final checks. Cameras loaded, dummies in position.
It all goes back to this, a Transport Canada crash test in 1984. Documented by the National Film Board, it had a surprise ending. The claim that school buses can keep children safe in accidents, even without seatbelts.
The high-back padded seats absorb the energy of the impact.
What's more, it said wearing a lap belt could create a whiplash effect that might actually be dangerous to kids in a head-on collision.
Could be enough to be fatal or result in serious injury.
Across North America, school boards largely rejected seatbelts because of that study. But school bus casualties kept climbing. At least 24 deaths in Canada since, over 100 dead in the U.S., and school bus injuries in both countries of more than 140,000. Yet Transport Canada's message always remained the same. Seatbelts won't help, and they might hurt. But now an investigation by the Fifth Estate has revealed serious problems with those Canadian crash tests and what they had to say about seatbelts in school buses. And we've also uncovered another Transport Canada study from 2010, which was not made public for 8 years until we recently asked to see it. That report found that school buses without seatbelts failed safety tests and didn't do enough to deter serious injury. In other words, it contradicted what Transport Canada itself had been telling us for years. Suzanne Tilco led that 2010 study.
What was the conclusion?
Well, the conclusion was with the seatbelts, that the seatbelts do prevent ejection.
But Transport Canada's website still insists there's no evidence school bus seatbelts would prevent injuries and save lives.
I've looked for these results on the website, and are they there? I haven't been able to find them.
I don't believe so. No, they're not there.
Then Canada's top vehicle researcher told us something no one at Transport Canada has publicly admitted before.
Bringing in the seatbelts is a good first step.
You are saying that, in your eyes, seatbelts in school buses should be done, should be undertaken?
It's a good first step. The seatbelt is your #1 defense. So the seatbelt is a great first step. Totally agree.
Good morning.
But what's the second step? Given that there's now an admission that seatbelts prevent injury and perhaps save lives, Canadian parents and kids might well ask, what is Transport Canada going to do about that?
And Bob joins us now. So Bob, help me understand. Transport Canada has been effectively sitting on this for 8 years now.
Yep.
Why are they only now coming around?
Yeah, specifically because we took it to them. It's their study, and we had really effectively to tell them about it. They didn't want this to happen. They didn't bring it out of their own volition. You know, these are the people who are our federal vehicle safety regulators. They're responsible for vehicle safety for all Canadians. And I think clearly it is not unreasonable to expect that they will not hide or suppress or otherwise ignore information that will improve vehicle safety, like seatbelts in school buses.
And so what would be the opposition to it then? I mean, to act on this study?
Well, they have been aligned over the years with what they call their stakeholders: school bus manufacturers, school boards, drivers' unions, people who have a financial or other stake. Legal liability is one issue. So they have been on that side. But again, it seems totally unreasonable to go so far as to hide your own research to bend over backwards for them.
So what would it take at this point for them to say require seatbelts?
All Transport Canada has to do is essentially forge a regulation in Canada that says every new school bus must have the installation of 3-point belts. They did the same thing with coach buses after the Humboldt crash. Right. Now, the catch is that they can legislate installation, but not usage. The provinces and the territories have to have a regulation or some form of law that would make these something that had to be done. It's very contentious as to liability issues and whose responsibility will be. But look, the bottom line is we all know now, and Transport Canada certainly knows, that seatbelts in school buses prevent injury and save lives.
Fascinating work. Bob McEwen, one of the hosts of The Fifth Estate. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew.
And if you want to see the full investigation, of course you do, it'll be posted on our website. Just head over to cbc.ca/fifth.
The calls grew louder around the world today for Saudi Arabia to be called on the carpet to answer questions about the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi. The Washington Post columnist hasn't been seen for 12 days, and as Paul Hunter reports, the allegations about his demise are so disturbing, so sinister. Some in the United States now say relations with Riyadh may need to be completely reconsidered.
For the record, outside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul today, there was still no sign of Jamal Khashoggi, just police barricades and silence. Khashoggi, a dissident Saudi journalist living in exile in the U.S., went missing October 2nd. Last seen on this security video going into that consulate, Turkey believes a Saudi assassination squad was waiting inside and that he was captured, killed, and perhaps dismembered. His body removed in pieces from the Saudi compound.
If they lured this man into that consulate, they went medieval on him, and he was killed, and he was chopped up, and they sent a death crew down there to kill him and do all this, that'd be an outrage.
If Khashoggi's dead, said Republican Senator Marco Rubio today, the U.S. must respond, or it risks its own standing.
It undermines our ability to stand for morality and human rights all over the world. How can we criticize Putin for killing journalists if we're prepared to allow an ally to do the same?
But there's a lot to learn. There really is.
Donald Trump has seemed to equivocate yesterday, threatening severe punishment if the story's true, but also highlighting U.S.-Saudi ties. Trump's first international trip as president was to Saudi Arabia, and he suggested he may not want to risk derailing a huge U.S. arms contract with the Saudis. To any threat of punishment, the Saudis themselves today threatened a forceful counter-response. But in a signal other countries are growing impatient for a plausible explanation to Khashoggi's disappearance, Britain, France, and Germany today, in a joint statement, pressed the Saudis for answers.
If they've got nothing to hide, then they will and should cooperate. And if, as they say, this terrible murder didn't happen, then where is Jamal Khashoggi?
To that end, late today, the Saudis and the Turkish government spoke about a joint working group to investigate whatever happened in that consulate. Turkey welcomed this step, but for the moment, that's as far as it goes. Adrian.
So, Paul, you mentioned that Donald Trump's threat to punish the Saudis if allegations are true, but as tough as he talks, sometimes he also seems to be holding back a bit, too, it seems.
Indeed. The arms deal he talked about is for $110 billion, though there's some question whether those are actually firm sales with the Saudis. Still, Trump is certainly suggesting it'd be a bad idea to cancel the deal as punishment. He said that'd cost U.S. companies, kill jobs, and hurt the economy. But some have noted there's more in play here than just that. Over the years, Trump has often boasted that the Saudis have bought tens of millions of dollars in real estate from him, and so he likes them, he once said. His company made all kinds of money from Saudi business at Trump hotels, including one just down the street from here. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is tight with the Saudi crown prince, so it's tricky. And through it all, when it comes to Khashoggi, Trump may make threats, but he also emphasizes the Saudis deny any wrongdoing.
All right, thanks, Paul. The CBC's Paul Hunter in Washington tonight. Now, Saudi Arabia, it seems, has paid a bit of a steep price today for the growing controversy. Its main stock market index plummeted by 7% in less than 2 hours of trading. That's the biggest drop since oil prices crashed in 2014. Some stocks did rally by the end of the day, but the index was still down 3.5%. Investors largely scared off by the prospect of sanctions against the kingdom. The fallout is spreading now beyond the markets. The world's business elite are set to meet later this month in Riyadh for a conference that's called the Future Investment Initiative. But now some participants are bailing. The Financial Times, Bloomberg, CNN, and CNBC have withdrawn as media sponsors. The New York Times, The Economist, and several prominent journalists say they are no longer attending. And the same goes for some business leaders like Richard Branson and Uber's chief executive, and the giant investment bank JP Morgan Chase. The president of the World Bank has also withdrawn, citing a scheduling conflict, but not the woman who leads the International Monetary Fund.
Horrifying things have been reported, and I am horrified. But I have to conduct the business of the IMF in all corners of the world and with many governments.
Still slated to attend, Steve Mnuchin, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, and some representatives from Wall Street.
Back to Canada now. Some current and former telecom workers are shedding light on why you might sometimes get frustrating service when you call about your TV, internet, or cell phone account. Now, they've worked at Rogers, Fido, and Bell, and they say there's a reason they may seem reluctant to help you. Erica Johnson brings us this Go Public investigation.
Jason Harley worked at this Rogers call center for 2 years before quitting last year. He says when sales reps help customers cancel services, they lose points towards commission.
It does drastically affect your actual income when people make a cancellation. That was brutal.
And led to sales tactics, he said, to avoid losing commission, like transferring a customer who wants to cancel their service or lower their bill to another agent, or claiming services have been canceled when they haven't.
It's more like what has the agent not done, because what they didn't do is hit that button that cancels the services.
This call center worker for Fido says she fears she'll lose her job if she's identified. She admits she puts customers who want to lower their plans on hold.
You say, I have to research something here and put them on hold. You're hoping they'll just hang up so you don't have to take the hit.
In a statement, Rogers, which owns Fido, wrote, "We take these concerns raised very seriously and we have no tolerance in our organization for unethical behavior." A call center employee who handled Bell customers and recently quit says he'd be financially penalized if he didn't lowball customers when it came to offering discounts.
I can give you a $5 discount on your TV. No? All right. Well, how about $10? No? How about $15, right? So you're going to want to, you start low and work your way up, right? They don't want you offering the highest amount to begin with.
In a statement, Bell wrote, discounts may vary based on factors such as the length of time the customer has been with us, the type of product, and so on.
I just can't believe a giant telecom behaves in that way.
This UBC business professor says telcos need to be careful about how incentive systems affect employee behavior.
My advice would be you need to change your incentive system, otherwise you're going to lose your employees and you're going to lose your customers.
And Erica joins us now. So Erica, help me understand something. If these ex-employees say they were penalized for lowering customers' plans and just for being the unfortunate one who happened to take the call at the time, how do the companies justify that?
You know, we asked Bell and Rogers about that. They declined our interview request, but in their written statements, they also don't address that question. You can see from their perspective, though, Andrew, why they would want to encourage employees to try to get customers to keep their services, because then it doesn't affect their bottom line.
So what then can people do to try to get better customer service from their providers?
Well, we spoke to a number of call center service reps, and they had some good tips. One of them being use live chat if your telecom service provider has that option, because then you can request a transcript be emailed to you. Call your provider during the day. Employees with the most experience tend to get the better shifts, so they earn better pay and they're less reliant on commission. Ask for help from a manager. They're often not penalized for reducing services. Always request an email after negotiating with a call center rep, because that way you can confirm that the email reflects your discussion. And lastly, make your own recording, because that way you have your own record of what was promised to you.
Right. Desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose, is the way it goes these days sometimes.
Pretty interesting stuff.
Erica Johnson, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Legal marijuana is just 3 days away, and the air is pretty thick with unanswered questions around enforcement, workplace rules, even whether supply can meet demand. So a little bit later, we will ask the experts to clear up some of the cloudier issues. But first, let's examine how legal pot could play out in your own home. If you live in an apartment or condo building, lighting up could actually be forbidden. Lorenda Redekop looks at the implications.
Bethany Ray is a recreational marijuana user.
It's a little bit of vapor there, but that's dissipating.
She likes to vape inside her home.
I don't think vaporizing smells nearly as much. For some products there's a slight odor, but I don't feel like this is any more than if I burn some incense or put my aromatherapy diffuser on.
Technically, using pot is still against the law. She finds it ironic that apartments and condos are becoming more vigilant now.
I do feel as a cannabis consumer there's now more things to get in trouble for than there was previously to legalization.
And she might be right.
And all this is high-rises.
This lawyer and her firm have helped more than 100 condo boards add rules about pot.
Here's the thing. Nobody's going to be going into the units on a daily basis to inspect if anybody's smoking. The only time the corporation's really going to understand or learn that somebody's smoking is when there's a complaint.
But if there is a complaint, she says, look out, even if you're a medical marijuana user.
I think it's going to be tough to get a doctor to say that the only way you can take cannabis is through smoking. And that's the only way you'll get relief.
At this condo complex, even smoking or vaping way out here is now off limits.
I think there's definitely a big overreaction, especially when it comes to the medical side of it.
James O'Hara is a medical cannabis user, diagnosed with a condition that causes seizures in the brain.
It was utterly life-changing for me. I was able to reduce my seizures by about 80 or 90%.
He spoke to his condo board and got an exemption, but worries other medical users may not know they can.
So the Human Rights Code essentially trumps what's going on in terms of the actual condominium rules. And in fact, a lot of the communication that comes out doesn't even state that. And they said, well, we didn't want to sort of create a map or a how-to, to get around that, which I thought was a little bit strange.
Every condo and apartment building is bringing in its own rules. Bethany Ray plans to keep vaping unless someone complains. Lorenda Redekop, CBC News, Toronto.
So, Andrew, we have a national conversation about pot later in the show. I know you're leading it. I have about a bazillion questions. What kind of questions are you going to try to answer?
Yeah, you and everyone else. So one example, can employers really prevent you from using cannabis even when you're at home? Or what is the government's timeline for clearing people's marijuana-related criminal records? Canadians, boy, they have loads of questions. We'll have some of them ask the experts, even the federal minister in charge directly, face-to-face.
All right, we'll watch for that. We are also watching some developing stories tonight, beginning with condolences pouring in for former federal cabinet minister Donald MacDonald.
We're going to be having to make some important changes in Canada.
MacDonald was Pierre Trudeau's finance minister in the mid-70s. Later, he headed a royal commission that recommended Canada enter a free trade agreement with the United States. He was 86. There they are. Harry and Meghan arrived in Sydney tonight for their first royal tour since getting married. They will take in, lucky them, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, and Tonga.
And still ahead on The National, Briar Stewart takes us to the banks of the Adams River in BC, where sockeye salmon are returning home, and thousands have come to watch and to learn as well.
It's amazing. You have to watch this. Plus, the odd reason why hundreds of Montrealers spent hours in a lineup. Stay with us for our moment of the day.
Do you break out into a cold sweat every time you have to calculate the tip? If doing math in real life makes you anxious, you're not alone. Math anxiety is a real thing, and here's what it's actually doing to your brain. Experts say that math anxiety is the urge to avoid numbers. It's seen in children as young as 6, and it plagues more girls than boys. But it's not just an aversion to numbers. It turns out that math anxiety could actually hijack your brain.
I'm Erin Maloney, and I'm a professor at the University of Ottawa. I study cognitive and emotional factors that can relate to achievement in mathematics. Researchers have used what's called fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. What we can see is that for people who are really anxious about math, they have activation both in the areas of the brain that are sort of responsible for mathematical processing, but also areas of the brain that are responsible for fear responses. So in some ways, for these individuals who are really anxious about math, their neural activation patterns look similar to someone who would, say, have a spider phobia, or really an intense fear in a situation.
So it's like your brain trying to solve two problems at the same time, anxiety and geometry. And that extra toll on the brain can cause a lot of students to underperform in math class. But the problem just doesn't exist with students. Research shows there are high levels of math anxiety with elementary school teachers and parents too, and that could rub off on the students, especially when they're trying to teach them about math or when parents are helping their kids with homework. So how do we solve this problem? Well, experts say that we need to stop with the stereotypes about math.
Often, people who are really anxious about math will endorse stereotypes about math. So for example, they'll endorse the stereotype that some people just aren't math people. And I think that's simply just not true. So while math might come a little bit more easily to some people, pretty much everyone can learn math.
The small wonders all around you. You'll be amazed by what you see.
Right now, they're not thinking about how smart it was to install a motion sensor light. They're not thinking about how much energy it saves. They're just enjoying sleeping through the night. And that feels good.
The world is full of wonders, but it's not just the big things that are incredible. Incredible is everywhere, at every size. Take a closer look at the small wonders all around you. You'll be amazed by what you see.
For years, the sockeye salmon population in BC has seen some dramatic declines, and for years, Ottawa has tried to figure out why. Just this past week, the government launched its latest effort to rebuild the Pacific salmon population. And one area that's worth a closer look runs along the Adams River in BC's interior. It's one of North America's most important spawning grounds for returning sockeye. But as Briar Stewart reports, how many of the salmon are making the trip is unclear.
In the shallows of the Adams River, these weary sockeye have reached their final destination. Every 4 years, the vast majority of salmon who were born here return once more. Thousands come to watch them, including Nobi Fujita, who's here from Japan.
Very, very exciting. And they fight till the end.
This is one of North America's largest sockeye salmon runs. About 1 million of the fish are expected to return here this year, traveling more than 450 kilometers to be here to spawn. It's a big draw. Even dozens of divers head into the river to get a closer look.
Often we're faced with a lot of controversy and politics around what is going on with the salmon and conservation of the species, but here we get to come together and celebrate.
The fish takes up oxygen out of the water. It's a chance for education too. Salmon are not only very valuable to the economy, but they're important to the environment. They're food for other species, and when the fish die, their carcasses act as fertilizer for the forest. But many salmon populations in BC are in decline. Warmer water, pollution, and fishing all play a role.
The Adams Run is an anomaly. Most other salmon species on the Fraser River have been listed as either endangered or threatened.
This fisheries expert believes there should be more restrictions on commercial fishing downstream.
Nice and firm.
Given that there's always some uncertainty around how many fish there are and how many will survive the trip to the spawning grounds.
We did have concerns, but overall I think the returns that we've seen have been very good and have provided fishing opportunities.
By the time the salmon make it here, no one is fishing for them because their bodies are already breaking down. Shortly after spawning, they'll die.
For us, Japanese salmon is something good to eat. That's all. Well, once I'm here, I respect for the nature, the cycle, how it works.
Many here have a new appreciation for just what the salmon went through to get here and why it's so important they keep returning. Briar Stewart, CBC News on the Adams River in BC.
Well, just days till the Liberals fulfill a key election promise and legalize marijuana. But is Canada ready? In a survey done for CBC News, 55% of Canadians said they do not believe the government is prepared for legalization of cannabis. What about health, crime, kids? Tonight, we're getting your answers to your questions about legal pot right after the break.
Just a good level?
Give us a little more. I need to. I don't want to.
I've been moving calm, don't start no trouble.
Killing the vibe at that point.
Yeah, I know. You know, gonna get letters. So I'm not the expert, but to me this is like Drake 2018, right?
Yes, correct. What's happening here is singing, talking, rapping. You can't really pinpoint what's going on here. Yeah. And what's interesting is that the rules of rap has changed dramatically. Because if Run DMC in the 80s or LL Cool J or Beastie Boys were to tell you the rules then, they would be very, very pissed off right now. Yeah. And say the rules in the 90s had kept the rule book, kept it clean. The rule book now is getting quite dusty. And I'd say Drake is in the forefront of that. If you listen to this,
what do you think? Like, what do you mean by that? What is he doing to hip hop today with a song like this?
So if you, back in the day, if you wrote down the lyrics to a hip hop song, you're turning pages on pages on pages. If you write lyrics to this song down, you love me, I said only partly. I'm sorry. You know, it's over.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Yeah.
It's very, very sparse, but I think it's also adding to what our brains need right now, which is a positive thing. We don't want dense right now.
Yeah.
If we want dense, we'll go read a novel or something quietly somewhere. But because music is so
this
much
is consumable, this is digestible.
Consumable. It's digestible. It's basically the BPMs, the beat per minutes are slowed down.
Yeah.
He's basically repeating himself. Now I'll tell you this is very, very difficult to do, to make it sound so simple. The simplest things that are catchy are very, very difficult to make.
So you're not, as a rapper, you don't scoff at this?
No, I don't. I actually tip my hat to it because if I were to try to make a very simple, laid-back track that repeats the same words, it's very difficult to figure out what those same words are going to be without annoying people, without boring people. It's got to be catchy. So, I mean, if he's going to say, it's even difficult to just, he's saying that they're wishing on me, But to say they wish and a wish and a wish
Just kind of
and
draw
a
it
wish
out
and
and
a
all
wish.
laid back.
If you sit back and go, okay, that they're wishing on me, how am I going to?
In just 72 hours,
cannabis will be legal in Canada.
our country is about to change.
It's a big deal. Bit more oomph.
This is a big deal.
I feel excited about legalization of cannabis.
I've been waiting for this day for so long.
I feel like it's a really important step forward for our society.
I call it cannabis.
Weed.
Mishkiki. Weed.
Cannabis. Cannabis.
Blaze it. Okay, sorry.
The first time I used cannabis was to help treat my migraines.
The first time I used cannabis, I was enlightened.
It's almost like a miracle drug for me.
I've never used cannabis.
I'm worried that
the
distribution will cause people to head more towards dealers.
That after legalization, marijuana will become too expensive.
that local producers and local dispensary owners will not be included.
That some people are going to overdo it when cannabis is first legalized, but overall I think it's going to be positive.
There is a lot of unanswered questions. I have questions.
I have questions.
I need answers.
I need answers.
I need answers.
In just 3 days, cannabis will be legal right across Canada, not just for medicinal use, but for whatever use you may have for it. You can smoke it, drink it, eat it, consume it just about any way you like. But how is it all going to work? Well, we've invited Canadians, all with a serious stake in this issue, to ask their questions. Some of them joining us here in studio, some will hear by video, and to answer those questions, we have joining us our esteemed panel, Bill Blair, Federal Minister of Border Security and Organized Crime Reduction. He's been the government's lead on the cannabis file. Thanks so much for being here.
Andrew.
Dr. Gigi Osler, head of the Canadian Medical Association. Gigi, Dr. Osler, which do you prefer?
Gigi is fine.
Gigi's fine, okay. And we have lawyer Kirk Tusaw, who's also a consultant for Canopy Growth. Kirk, I can call you Kirk, that's
Absolutely.
Okay?
Thanks,
all right,
Andrew.
We'll keep things conversational. And that is, of course, one of the world's largest cannabis companies. So thank you to the three of you for being here. Now, I do want to be clear. This isn't a debate about whether legalization is the right thing to do. It is happening, period. And most Canadians support that. Indeed, the folks asking questions tonight do too. But there are questions. So let's try to understand all of this a little bit better. Let's get started. Take a look.
My name is Elaine Farrell. I have been working for the Toronto Transit Commission close to 27 years. And I am fighting for the rights to use cannabis CBD oil for the chronic pain that I have. I have bilateral sciatica in both legs. I have herniated disc in my lower back, 2 of them, and 1 in my neck. So I went on CBD oil for 2.5 months, and the difference was tremendous.
Elaine, thanks for being here. What's your question?
How will the workers' rights be balanced and my rights to be able to use cannabis either for medicinal or recreational?
Right. And so, Minister Blair, this is, I think, perhaps an appropriate question for you, because I suppose on the medicinal side, employers do have an obligation to accommodate their employees, as in any medical situation.
In fact, in Canada, we've had experience with medical cannabis for almost 2 decades in this country. And employers are working, I think, very diligently right now to ensure that we strike the appropriate balance between the right of their employers to have appropriate medical treatments and a safe workplace.
So on the recreational side of things, though, that's where it gets a little bit murkier. I mean, what is the framework there?
So for people who are in a safety-sensitive position, there are likely to be developed rules regarding cannabis use and fitness for the work that they are required to perform. You know, there's been a lot of research on this and a lot of work done, but I think more needs to be done. And we're hearing, just last week, a number of police services and the Canadian Forces have come out with new regulations with respect to that issue as well.
Except, I mean, what's noteworthy about that is in a way, it seems like different workplaces are scrambling in different ways, and the differences are stark just when we talk about police forces. So Calgary Police will not be allowed to use cannabis at all, not even when off duty. Toronto Police won't be permitted to use cannabis within 28 days of reporting for duty. West Vancouver Police restricting cannabis to within 24 hours of a shift. In Saskatchewan, there's no time limit at all, so long as you are fit for duty when you report to work. This seems like a bit of a patchwork series of solutions and quite confusing.
Well, I think a number of chiefs are being quite cautious. The standard that has been in place for over a century for police officers is they have to be fit for duty. Frankly, it's a fairly straightforward determination for those who might be under the influence of alcohol, for example. But, you know, the familiarity with cannabis impairment among law enforcement officials is perhaps not as developed. But I think those positions will evolve over time based on the evidence.
Kirk, does an employer have the right to reach into a person's personal life and say, you know, it's one thing to say you can't consume cannabis while you're here at work, but you also can't do it at home?
I don't think they should have that right. I mean, at the end of the day, this is going to be a legal substance to consume for recreational or any purpose that you wish. And the concern I have is that a lot of employers may rely on drug testing to determine impairment. And drug testing for cannabis in particular is a difficult subject because cannabis metabolizes into your fat and is stored by your body for a tremendously long period of time, weeks or over a month. And so when you're testing people for the presence of these metabolites, you're not really getting a clear picture of whether they were, to use Minister Blair's words, fit for the job, fit for duty.
What is considered impairment at work, and who decides that for the workers?
Well, it's interesting. Minister Blair said something about alcohol and said essentially it's pretty easy to tell if somebody's not fit for duty when it comes to alcohol. And that's because alcohol produces significant impairing effects. Cannabis, particularly for people that use it on a chronic basis for medical conditions, I have for the last 17 years for chronic pain, very difficult to tell if somebody's, you know, quote unquote, impaired by cannabis, even though they might be under the influence of it.
Does the research shed any light on this? Because, Kirk, as you point out, I mean, THC can stay in the body for an awful long time.
I think the research is very varied. And I agree with Minister Blair that more research will help to shed a light on impairment and usage and help reduce some of the discomfort that employers may be feeling.
Okay, our next question. This is from Signe in British Columbia. Watch this.
My name is Signe Knudsen. I'm an artist and a mom. I'm also a medicinal and recreational cannabis user. What I want to know is once cannabis is legalized, what are the parental liabilities if a teenager accesses it at home? Also, wouldn't it be safer if kids are going to use it anyway for a teen to access it at home from a parent instead of illegally somewhere else?
Okay, Kirk, I think this is one for you. And we'll start with the first part of her question, which was, I suppose, the legal consequences of a child, a teenager getting into their parents' stash.
Well, I'm a parent of 4. I've got kids ranging from 8 to 18 years of age, so it's a question that I've thought about. I also have cannabis in my home because I'm a cannabis consumer and have been for 32 years. I think there's a way we deal with this in society right now with respect to alcohol. And we don't impose some sort of arbitrary restrictions on parental conduct. We don't criminalize parents who have alcohol. We don't require parents to put locks on their alcohol cabinets, even though consumption of alcohol, we know, leads to death or serious danger to youngsters.
So fair point. It's hard to imagine a scenario where you could accidentally do 8 shots of tequila. But I think...
Is it?
I think you might notice on the first shot.
There are young people consuming too much alcohol on a daily basis.
So that's fair. However, what I would say is it's much easier for me to imagine a scenario where a teenager might accidentally ingest a pot brownie or a gummy bear that's infused with cannabis and not even realize it in that moment and only realize it minutes, hours down the line.
I think this, and I'm putting my parent hat on right now, I think this is an opportunity for parents to start having conversations with their children about cannabis use and how to use it safely and wisely. In terms of accidental ingestion for children, one recommendation may be to treat it like a prescription medication or treat it like alcohol. Keep it out of the reach of young children in particular. Because young children, let's say it isn't edible and they think it's a gummy or they think it's a brownie, and whatever amount they ingest may be just simply too much for their smaller bodies.
And I just wanted to clear up something that the lady who spoke earlier, when she talked about, isn't it better to give the drug to your kids if they're going to use it anyway? I want to be really clear. No, it's not. And the law is clear that it is an offense. It'll be an offense under these regulations and the law to give cannabis or to sell cannabis to a person under the age of 18.
But criminalizing parents, for providing cannabis to their teenagers in the home is an absolute horror show and a mistake. We don't do it for alcohol, and we know people can die from consuming alcohol. So we should not be doing it for cannabis. That was a miss by the federal government. It prevents exactly what we should be encouraging, which is conversations between parents and kids on a real level, not some artificial level dictated by government.
You know, one of the things that has followed people who consume cannabis is the stigma around it, certainly. Have a look at this. In a poll commissioned exclusively for CBC News, 36% of those asked believe that there will be less stigma around pot usage, which leads us to our next question.
Hi, my name is Malik Scott. Last year, I was arrested for marijuana possession. I believe that racial profiling had a huge part in that. The first time I was arrested, I was in a parking lot, and all of a sudden I see a cop car, and for some reason I got this strange feeling, and I decided to leave the parking lot. So as I'm leaving, they park right in front of me and kind of box me in. It was put on me time and time again that I had marijuana on me when I didn't, and I was taken into the police station for that. After that, the case was dropped. The second time, same song and dance as last time, I ended up getting pulled into the station. Again, they found nothing on me, and I was sent on my way.
Hi, Malik. What's your question?
So with this future legalization coming up, I'm wondering how exactly will it affect racial profiling and policing? Also, the people who've been convicted and even incarcerated for cannabis use or dealing, what have you, will they receive any amnesty when it is legalized?
Racial profiling is abhorrent, unacceptable, and unlawful. It's unlawful in Canada. It's contrary to the Canadian Human Rights Act. It's contrary to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so any individual and any police officer engaging in racial profiling is breaking the law.
And would you concede that it has been a problem?
Oh, I've conceded many, many years ago. If you don't acknowledge its existence, you can't do anything about it. We've worked awfully hard to actually address some of those concerns.
And so how does legalization change the equation?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that the enforcement of cannabis laws in Canada has had a disproportionate effect on minority communities, racialized communities, young black men, Indigenous, mostly young males, but also all Indigenous people, poorer communities. There has been a disproportionate and therefore unjust impact on many communities. And our government's made it very clear, starting on the 17th of October, when the law is repealed and replaced, it gives us an opportunity to take a look at those convictions that some people have for simple possession of cannabis and deal with those in the appropriate way at the appropriate time.
But why couldn't that have been done concurrently with all of the planning to establish this regulatory framework?
Simply because you cannot nullify the law. Until the repeal in place takes place, the law remains in effect. It's the only system of cannabis control that currently exists.
And could this not all have unfolded very quickly? I mean, let me ask it a different way. What is it that
many people are suggesting we're going too fast, but quite frankly, we've been very cautious and careful as we've approached these new regulations. On October 17th, that takes effect. And from that moment on, we stop criminalizing those kids for criminal possession of cannabis, and it also gives us an opportunity after to deal more appropriately with those existing records, and that's our intent.
Do you believe that there'll be any amnesty given to the people already incarcerated and have had their time taken from them?
Malik, the law that existed was upheld and enforced. It's been tested in our courts and found to be constitutional. But we believe that the impact of those criminal records is disproportionate to the offense. And we know that it's been disproportionately impactful on certain communities, and we want to fix that.
Let's look forward. In legal jurisdictions where cannabis has been legalized, where possession of cannabis has been legalized, you've seen tremendous drops in enforcement. You've seen something like 90 to 95% drops in enforcement of the cannabis laws. And so I think we're going to see it get better. I find it somewhat unfortunate that the Cannabis Act continues to take a criminal law-based approach with exemptions. I'm looking forward to legalization 2.0 when we can move beyond a criminal law-based approach and have a truly regulatory-only approach. And I think we'll get there. I hope we get there soon.
Okay, please do stay with us. When we come back, we'll have this question.
What do we have in place to address marijuana addiction after legalization?
We're not merely legalizing cannabis. We're implementing a very strict and comprehensive system of regulation.
But a system that already exists in terms of alcohol, and yet we Okay, welcome back. Tonight, something special. We're looking at some of the unanswered questions that still persist just days before cannabis becomes legal in Canada. Let's get to our next question.
My name's Josie. I have struggled with mental health issues for most of my teen years. I started smoking weed at 14, and by 15, I was a full-blown pothead. I consider myself to be a marijuana addict, and I'm getting treatment for it right now. I will take a dark roast, please. The symptoms that I struggled with were intense paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and sometimes visual hallucinations. I received treatment for it, and I no longer struggle with psychosis, but I do struggle with cannabis addiction. I would tell other young people in Canada to respect marijuana as a mind-altering substance, not to demonize cannabis use, but to do it responsibly if they are going to do it underage. Please keep in mind that your brain has not finished developing and that you could have negative effects.
What is the question that you'd like to ask?
My question is, what do we have in place to address marijuana addiction after legalization, especially for youth? And there's not a lot of research to show what the long-term impact of regular cannabis use is, especially among young brains. And I was wondering what the government has planned to address this issue.
First of all, I want to thank Josie for her question. I think your testimony is compelling. And I would like every young person to hear the caution that you offer from your lived experience, because I think young people have to know that this drug is not necessarily benign and that there are significant risks.
You know, alcohol, pretty easy for teens to get a hold of, despite the regulation in place. I think, quite frankly, it's easy to get cannabis as well. Is that just going to get worse?
It's very important to understand, Andrew, that we're not merely legalizing cannabis. We're implementing a very strict and comprehensive system of regulation that'll control every aspect of its production, distribution, and consumption.
But a system that already exists in terms of alcohol, and yet we have a problem.
Well, we do have a problem, but one of the challenges with cannabis, you know, Josie mentioned the lack of research. In a criminal prohibitive environment, research has been very, very challenging, if not impossible, in a lot of jurisdictions, simply because how do you do longitudinal tests or clinical trials in an environment where you're talking about an illegal substance? And so it's only in a regulated environment that research can now begin to take place. We also recognize, and our government has said, the revenue that is generated from the excise sales, the excise tax of cannabis, needs to be reinvested in research, prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation.
But help me to understand exactly what you're saying here, because are you saying that the bulk of the meaningful research can't really happen until regulation happens, and
no,
so therefore between
first
now
of all, there has been a great deal of research, but in a regulated environment, I think that creates a new environment for research that will be far more effective and allow us to learn more about the use and misuse of this substance.
If I could ask you then, at this point, do you expect marijuana use, overuse, and addiction to get markedly worse?
My very sincere hope is that through making it more difficult for young people to access this drug, by displacing the illicit market, which will take time, but that's very much part of what we're trying to achieve.
But we all hope that. I think we're all on the same page.
But Andrew, right now, under the criminal sanction, we have the highest rates of cannabis use among our kids of any developed country in the world. And we just have to do better.
Is what you're hearing here, does that resonate for you? I mean, is this the start of an answer for you?
When I was smoking weed in high school, there was no legal weed smoking age. Right. So there was no, this is how to do it responsibly. So I don't think marijuana should be demonized, but I do think that people should have as much information about marijuana, especially if you're under 25, on how marijuana can impact you. And I hope that there is an education plan in place, maybe in schools, to say, oh, marijuana is impacting your school life, or you're overly paranoid to the point of psychosis. Who am I going to talk to? And is it okay to say, hey, marijuana is not right for me?
Dr. Osler, clear the air a bit for us. What do we know about the long-term health impacts of cannabis use, particularly on young people?
Well, Josie's talked about the age of 25, and we know brain development continues up until the age of 25. And we also know that the younger cannabis use starts, the more frequent the use, the type of product is being used, can have an effect on that developing brain. And personally, I'm heartened to hear from Minister Blair that more resources will be put into counseling and addiction services. I think it's vitally important to have that in place as a promise to Canadians.
Josie, thank you.
Thank you so much
for your question. We did have many more questions from Canadians concerned about cannabis legalization, including these.
What is the government going to do to foster innovation in the cannabis industry?
Is it fair to say that when you talk about innovation, edibles is one key area?
Edibles is one area, absolutely.
How can we convince these young and novice drivers that driving while impaired by cannabis, it can be dangerous?
Will the government respect Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights to self-regulate the cannabis industry within our own territories?
Minister Blair?
Yeah, it's an important discussion.
Much more to see. You can catch a special extended version of the National Conversation Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on CBC News Network. We hope you'll tune in.
Next on the National, old platform signs, bus fare boxes, even subway seats. A different kind of garage sale attracted hundreds of Montrealers today, eager to bring home a piece of Metro history. We'll show you all that in our moment.
It's something that's unique. Not everybody can have it. It's not for sale anywhere usually, and it's part of history, and I love Montreal.
A mango is a mango is a mango, right? Well, not quite. These mangoes have been zapped. They've been irradiated with a dose roughly equivalent to 10,000 chest x-rays.
Good. Approved by the FDA, the USDA, nice. The EPA.
Delicious.
This peculiar taste test took place in Miami Beach 2 months ago. Lorenzo's became the first place in North America ever to sell irradiated fruit. And there's a chance irradiation may come to Canada. Instead of mangoes, we may end up eating zapped chicken. The irradiation of food may become one of the hottest health issues of the 1980s.
Here is the first really new method of food preservation.
You want to get nuked? Sure, go for it, and let's build a silo in my backyard.
Oh, I have eaten irradiated food, and I certainly would actively look for it if it was in the supermarket.
This is cobalt-60, a byproduct of Canada's nuclear reactors, and the most common power source of food irradiation. This is how it works. Chicken, for example, goes into the irradiator on large pallets. Inside, the cobalt-60 rods are raised from a pool of water. The chicken revolves around the radioactive source. The rods are returned to the water, and the irradiated chicken moves outside. The government is now considering allowing the irradiation of poultry for 2 reasons. Firstly, to cut down salmonella poisoning. Most cases of salmonella poisoning in Canada involve poultry. Secondly, to extend shelf life. For 40 years, scientists have studied food irradiation, and most have declared it safe. They point to the astronauts who munch their way to the moon on zapped steak. They say it's safer, cheaper, and more effective than chemical sprays and fumigants. Sprays and fumigants that in some cases have been outlawed.
We're looking in agriculture for non-chemical means of protecting the crops or the animals.
Dr. Norm Tape of Agriculture Canada has just been made chairman of a UN group of all 26 nations that currently irradiate food.
Irradiation isn't going to be a panacea. It's not going to be our milk supply or breads and our meats and our fish and all that. I think there are going to be selected applications where there are health benefits and it's economically feasible.
The people that work here at Atomic Energy of Canada Limited have asked the government for approval to irradiate poultry. They're waiting for the government's decision with great interest. Most of the 140 irradiators now in use around the world have been produced right here. In the majority of cases, they're used to sterilize medical and hospital disposable goods like surgeon's gloves or cotton swabs. It's a multi-million-dollar business, a growth sector in a nuclear industry that has been slumping badly. If the government gives the green light for food irradiation, AECL could be the big winner.
Well, we're talking many millions of dollars of business a year, well downstream.
Bruce Wilson is AECL's director of marketing. He's sold irradiators around the world from China to South Africa, $15 million worth over the last year alone.
Given that you have a regulation in place, you have the world's biggest and best supplier of this technology in your own backyard.
Hundreds of people joined the queue, a line that snaked around city blocks. So what on earth would inspire this many people to line up early on a Sunday morning? Well, it was apparently Montreal's public transit agency's garage sale, and vintage hunters just jumped at the chance to get their hands on some Metro memorabilia, and that, of course, is our moment of the day.
They have like a cultural impact. It's you know, the Metro in Montreal is kind of a big thing.
I was here at 8 o'clock, so 2 hours. My feet are still numb.
Was it worth it?
Yeah, totally.
We had someone yesterday who wanted a Laurier Station sign because they said the couple met at Laurier Station. So Laurier was something very important for them in their history.
It's something that's unique. Not everybody can have it. It's not for sale anywhere usually, and it's part of history. And I love Montreal.
You're really taking a stroll down memory lane with this Metro seat. It's from the original 1966 Metro car. It really is a piece of history, and along with it, you get a piece of gum.
That's a nice touch. And Adrian, I'm pretty sure, I mean, I remember from my Montreal days, I sat in those very seats many, many times. The gum isn't mine, though, I promise. But so I find it also interesting, fun fact, they didn't have this sale, you know, just for kicks, just to sell the memorabilia. The garage that they were all being stored in was actually set to be demolished, so they did this out of necessity.
And here's how much people care. Andrew, there was one Metro employee who showed up. He bought a fare box and said, when I die, I'm going to be incinerated. I want my ashes put in there. So that's how much they care.
Okay.
That is the National for Sunday, October 14th. Good night.
Good night.